Welcome to another episode of the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. A progressive insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining podcast designed to shine a light on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters, located in his attic, here's the award-winning Pat Johnston.
Oh, yeah. Welcome to another edition of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am Pat Johnston. Well, we're here, everyone. Just a few days away from what is the biggest election of my lifetime. The previous biggest election of my lifetime was probably the 2004 election when John Kerry fell just short of defeating incumbent George W. Bush. It was the biggest election of my lifetime then because had John Kerry won in 2004, we'd probably draw down from Iraq sooner. We have a president who would have had the bully pulpit to highlight the need to switch to a clean energy economy after the Hurricane Katrina disaster. And we also have a president who does not nominate Samuel Alito and John Roberts to the United States Supreme Court. That did turn out to be the most consequential election of my lifetime, and I didn't even mention the financial meltdown of 2008. Now, of course, that means we wouldn't have gotten Barack Obama in 2008, which I know kind of goes against my stance about 2004 because Obama's election was one of the more gratifying nights for me on a political level. And I have to tell you, I thought the nation had, after those horrid George W. Bush years, I really thought that we had turned a corner. I really did. But I underestimated the power of white nationalism and white resentment. I underestimated it so much that I was one of those who thought there was no way America would ever elect a certifiable buffoon for president. A buffoon who banked on white resentment carrying him just enough so that way he could get to the White House thanks to our antiquated electoral college system. And after 4 years of living in this country with a guy and his corrupt family living in the White House, and a guy and his corrupt family and his cult supporters who tried to overturn the 2020 election by blowing up our democratic institutions, I'm considering this to be the most important election, not just in my lifetime, but perhaps the biggest election since Abraham Lincoln's victory in 1860. I think it's that big. It's an election not just against two political parties who have different tax and economic philosophies, and it's not even two parties who have differences on foreign policies. It's an election pitting the white nationalist / fascist MAGA Republican Party against those of us who believe in democracy, a democracy that has survived for 248 years. It's an election with those on one side trying to improve the lives of all Americans, and the other side that's all about throwing out immigrants, i.e. brown immigrants, even if that means blowing up the economy and, destroying millions of lives and costing billions and billions of dollars. All in the name of white nationalism, all in the name of fascism. That's why I want to play this clip from what was once known as the progressive show called the Young Turks. Now, for those of you who don't know the Young Turks, it was billed as a progressive news alternative to the corporate media structure, a structure that gave us George W. Bush, for example. Now, if you don't mind, please indulge me for just a moment to go back to the mid-2000s. It was after Bush's re-election. I was working in farm radio, dealing with lots and lots and lots of white Republicans, and I was feeling despondent. I really was. I remember how I was viewing politics in 2005 at that time. And one reason I was probably despondent was because I felt alone, because finding decent progressive programming anywhere was near impossible. But then I got my first Sirius radio back in 2006, and that's when I stumbled upon this radio show called The Young Turks with Cenk Uygur, Ben Mankiewicz, Dave Kohler, and Jill Pike. And I have to tell you, what I've been there, about 28 years old, it was refreshing to hear the kind of in-your-face yet comical at times progressive talk that the Young Turks provided. Now look, I like Tom Hartman. He's been one of the more successful talk radio hosts on the left for years. I respect him, and I really think he does a fine job, and he's been successful because he's awesome at educating people and providing historical background on policy and politics. Tom does a fine job, but he isn't exactly an aggressive talker, and he's also a baby boomer. The Young Turks, I was able to identify with a bit more because they represented more my generation, Generation X. And the show's founder and leader, the aforementioned Cenk Uygur, built the show on being a bit over the top, okay, maybe a lot over the top, but being a show that featured progressives fighting back, not just against the corporate conservative media machine, but also against the stereotypes of the quote-unquote liberal weenie, okay? And those of us who had to grow up in the 80s and 90s know exactly what I'm talking about there. I'm sorry, but that was a stereotype. And with Cenk and Ben Mankiewicz, by the way, Ben's father was Bobby Kennedy's press secretary in 1968 and is now one of the faces of Turner Classic Movies. And then along with Jill Pike, it was one of the more engaging progressive shows, which gained so much popularity so fast it became a YouTube sensation. And it grew and grew through the years, rightly so, especially during the Obama years when Cenk brought on a young person, a young reporter named Ana Kasparian. And the two of them would quickly become the face of the entire franchise. Now, I will tell you that through the years, I would say that I found myself agreeing with them maybe 50% of the time and disagreeing with them about 50% of the time. But they were entertaining. They at least had some policy discussions, which I enjoyed. And those disagreements I would have most of the time with the cast of the Young Turks would be more on political strategy, not necessarily on the policies that they would highlight. And again, they were entertaining. But then this past year, Ana Kasparian, who shined for so many years as a strong, progressive millennial, and who Cenk eventually gave editorial control of the show to, suddenly had this kind of shift this year, a kind of political awakening. All right. And look, when someone tells me that they've had a political awakening, watch out, because that usually means they're turning against progressives, that they are turning more conservative. And she has spent most of this year attacking Democrats, specifically attacking President Biden and Vice President Harris. Look, I'm all for criticizing Democrats and President Biden and Vice President Harris. I have done it many times here because you'll hear me say this so many times on the show. We are progressives. We are not a cult like MAGA. So we will be critical of our side when criticism is warranted. But Ana Kasparian has gone overboard with that criticism, and she's also sounded very right-wing at times by accepting the crime is everywhere trope, or how Americans are right to fear immigrants. But she's been defending, on top of that, she's been defending Trump many times on this once progressive show, saying that he reaches people because he bucks the establishment. Now, I'm not saying that Ana Kasparian ever said that she's voting for Trump. I don't think she is, but I don't think she's voting for Kamala Harris. But she spent a segment recently in which she argued that Dear Leader wasn't really losing his mental acuity. She actually spent about 15 minutes arguing with her viewers that Trump actually is all there mentally. And then she even did a long podcast recently where she explained why she left the left. But there's something else. There's something else that she's been doing, and that is chastising Democrats and progressives for saying that Trump and his MAGA cult are a fascist movement. Now, I've heard her say this before this week. Her and Cenk Uygur got into a debate. I'll talk about that in a second. But I just wanted to bring up Webster's dictionary that defines fascism as the following: a populist political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, that is associated with a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and by forced suppression of opposition. just reading that, it kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it, everyone? For example, at Dear Leader's white nationalism rally last weekend at New York's Madison Square Garden, his senior advisor, Stephen Miller, declared,
"The cartels are gone. The criminal migrants are gone. The gangs are gone. America is for Americans and Americans only."
Now look, I could spend a whole 10 episodes just talking about the MAGA fascist movement, which, you know what? Actually, when I think about it, this show has been highlighting the fascist movement that's happening in Michigan and across the country. I've been spending most of my time this year talking about that very subject. So with that being said, let me play an argument that Ana Kasparian and Cenk Uygur had on the Young Turks episode this week. And it was an argument that was going to happen sooner or later. And it's where Ana says that Trump is not a fascist. Listen.
Notion of a fascist. Because look, if we're just going to use fascist toward anyone we dislike, all right, then the word doesn't actually mean anything.
Okay, what do you want me to say, Ana? You want me to say wannabe dictator?
Sure, you can say wannabe dictator, but I don't even think he wants to be a dictator.
Of course he does. That's what you do when you lose an election and you go, oh, I got fake electors and I'd like to terminate the Constitution and bring out the tanks and use martial law against American citizens and shoot protesters. I mean, if that's not fascist, then I guess the word just shouldn't exist.
But was he able to do those things?
Trump's
no, his rhetoric is awful.
Okay, if you don't want to be called fascist, stop saying fascist things. It's not that hard.
Okay.
Not that hard. Oh, here, let me have dinner with Nick Fuentes, who's a Nazi, Kanye, who's a Nazi, and let me say there's good people on the Nazi side. Oh, it could be pro-Confederate guys. Might be guys who are pro-slavery who are good guys. Let me do all of these things. Let me say that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our nation, a Nazi term that is only used in the past by Nazis, and then say I'm going to ban Muslims, I'm going to do this and this and this to all the other ethnic groups, and then go, oh, I can't believe you called me a fascist. No, he is a fascist. I'm very happy to call him a fascist.
All right.
I mean, as much as I am critical of Cenk, he was absolutely correct here. While Ana tried to downplay the fascist movement inside the Republican Party. And how can she ask, well, did he get away with it? He nearly did get away with it, as Cenk said, and is prepared to do it all over again. Just because the bank robber failed at robbing the bank doesn't mean he's still not a bank robber. But I feel absolutely embarrassed for Kasparian because while she believes she's above the fray and is simply just choosing an intelligent route, she sounds like a buffoon, just like Dear Leader Trump, which is probably where she's headed because, well, that's where all the money is. It's not here in progressive talk. All the money is in right-wing crazy talk. But to believe that a Trump presidency is not a threat to our democratic institutions and to the future of this country, I'm sorry, is downright moronic and idiotic. I know there are many who believe Dear Leader speaks truth to power and tells it like it is, but all he's doing is finding ways to divide the people just enough, mind you, so that he gets into power to do what he's paid to do by the billionaire donors like Elon Musk and the Adelson family. His job is to redirect more wealth and more power to the rich and to the elite donor class, not to help the middle class, not to help those struggling to get by. His one main so-called accomplishment in his first 4 years was to pass massive corporate tax breaks and then to slash the taxes of the ultra-billionaire class to help those in the upper echelon while screwing the rest of us. As former Secretary of State Robert Reich posted this week on social media, the cost of extending the Trump tax cuts for billionaires and for further cutting the corporate tax rate like Dear Leader's promising to do, Reich says the cost of extending the expiring Trump tax cuts for the rich will cost $4.6 trillion. The cost of cutting corporate tax rates to 15% will cost us $1 trillion. Both Trump proposals will explode the deficit and be used as an excuse to gut programs that millions rely on. It's reverse Robin Hood. It is reverse Robin Hood, just like how Trump never cares about the workers or unions. He did everything in his power while president to decimate unions, especially by filling the National Labor Relations Board with corporate pals and stooges. And when push came to shove, when the UAW was picketing during its strike against the big three automakers, Trump the scab was nowhere to be found supporting the striking auto workers? Nowhere. We complained about high prices at grocery stores. And while Kamala Harris is out there talking about going after corporate price gouging and raising the corporate tax rate by just a little bit, Dear Leader's out there telling his people that corporations ought to be rewarded for their greedflation, rewarded for their price gouging, and rewarded even so they should have their taxes cut even more. How's that going to help the working class people, everyone? But yet so many are buying it. And how's another 4 years of normalizing this guy? How's another 4 years going to be when it comes down to women's health and economic freedoms around the country? I mean, we learned this week from another ProPublica article, they do such great work there, that another woman died thanks to the state of Texas's draconian abortion restrictions. Gisele Bernica was a 28-year-old mother, and she died in 2021. And while that was before the right-wing Trump majority in the Supreme Court ended Roe v. Wade, Texas already had a 17-week ban. And as Jessica Valenti wrote in her Substack on this tragedy, she wrote, I'm quoting, even though she was miscarrying at just 17 weeks into her pregnancy with no chance for the fetus's survival, doctors told Gisele they couldn't treat her while there was still a heartbeat. By the time her Houston hospital intervened, she had spent 2 days with the fetus pressed up against her open cervix, exposing her to bacteria. Gisele died of a preventable infection 3 days later. Pro-life. That's what a Dear Leader presidency brought us here in the United States of America. This is what his presidency brought us in states filled with MAGA majorities in their state legislatures. Hey, but don't worry, he and his MAGA Republicans won't institute a national ban if they gain control in Washington. Oh, come on. That's not going to happen whatsoever. This isn't a game, everyone. It's not. We are here to give voice to those who can't buy the best media or the best lobbyists. But that's why I hold out some hope that we will defeat this kind of hate-filled MAGA, white Christian nationalism at the polls next week. I know. The polls are everywhere, and one day you're feeling optimistic, and the next day you're not. But I do believe in an America where the rule of law, democracy, this country's ideals, and this country's decency will prevail because millions are longing for some kind of normalcy and competency. Like right here in Michigan, we've witnessed a shift thanks to hard-working activists and strong Democratic leaders who were tired of right-wing incompetency by Michigan Republicans. We saw local victories over MAGA majorities in some local county seat races, red counties, mind you, across the state because the people were just tired of the fascist, the xenophobic, anti-science, anti-women, anti-common sense MAGA movement. We saw victories in the Republican Ottawa County in the west side and in the Republican Delta County up in the UP. So look, I refuse to believe that those victories that happened this year happened in some vacuum. I refuse to believe that people want 4 more years of being ignored while Dear Leader's family continues to cash in on governmental power. I refuse to believe that people look at Dear Leader and will look at Kamala Harris and say, hey, honey, I can't tell who's the better between the two. I just refuse to believe that. I refuse to believe the people will reward someone who led an attack on our Capitol building and then tried to steal an election with the help of some powerful Republican Michiganders. I refuse to believe people really want 4 more years of this guy who will be in the news every single day, attacking the press, attacking his staff, calling neo-Nazis fine people, shelling out hundreds of billions of dollars to oil and gas companies, selling out our kids' futures by further destroying the planet, and doing whatever Project 2025 instructs them to do, like destroying the Department of Education, Head Start, and more. And I refuse to believe that the people are believing Dear Leader's side when they argue he would never sign a national abortion ban. I just want to believe that the people are tired and they want common sense back. They want competency back. I'm not saying Kamala Harris is the greatest politician of them all. You see, again, I'm not a cult member and I don't hold politicians to a godlike status, unlike MAGA. But I see an accomplished woman who can complete thoughts, who can articulate thoughts, who is decent, who wants to legitimately help people, and who wants to continue one of the best economic turnarounds that we've seen here in modern history. I also want to see a leader who believes in the experiment called America. A flawed country, yes, but one worth fighting for, one worth fighting to make better. Yes, I disagree with her boss's policy on Gaza and Israel, but I'm not going to hurt millions of people in the United States over it. I can't. There are too many lives on the line. And I have hope that we will do the right thing for our country in just a matter of days. Tell me what you think and how you're feeling about the election by emailing me, leftoflansing@gmail.com. That's leftoflansing@gmail.com. Back with more in a moment. You're listening to LOL.
A podcast that believes in using common sense to move Michigan into the future. And by common sense, we mean progressive sense. We've all seen what 40 years of Republican leadership did to this state, and we refuse to go back. It's Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. You can follow Pat on Facebook or X. Pat still calls it Twitter. Or on the Gram, Threads, and also on YouTube. Subscribe to the show on YouTube and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. All right, I think we gave Pat enough time to catch his breath. Let's get back to it. Here's Pat Johnston.
Just want to add a reminder to subscribe to Left of Lansing on YouTube. Soon I will begin doing some YouTube live videos, so that way I can interact with you and others who will be on. And I'm sure that the algorithms leading certain people there will be a sight to see. And also, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a 5-star review. Also, thanks to all of you for listening, and thank you for your emails. Aaron, thanks for your kind words last week, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to get back to you in time, but I thank you greatly for your message and for listening out there on the west side of the state. Coming up in the last call segment, I'd like to talk about why hundreds of thousands of people are canceling their subscriptions to corporate media outlets and why alternative independent media is the wave of the future. Right now, though, I'd like to focus a few moments on the fight to keep the Michigan State House blue. Progressive Democratic State Representative Emily Devendorf from the 77th House District around Lansing was supposed to join us here this week, but other commitments during the final week of campaigning made them unavailable to appear on the podcast this week, and we completely understand here. And I can't wait to talk with the representative, as their people promised me that they'd appear right after the election. Now, Representative Devendorf told me last year here on the podcast why the cornerstone to our democratic process is the right to vote.
So it's important to me that we do more election protection and make voting accessible, because voting is the most essential, bare minimum entry action we can do to be a part of democracy. And after that is accountability for our electeds. We should be in continuous communication with our electeds. And I was telling somebody that works for Gary Peters the other day, one of our Republican trackers reached out to me the other day. And I told you I talk to everybody, and I'm always very kind, but also I know who my constituents are. And I get to know everybody, and I've gotten to know this person, and he needed help with his voter registration. And what's important to me is that people vote. And I said, yes, let me help you. And we figured it out. And it was just like the loveliest conversation. I won't fill you in on all of it, but to me, it was just like, I really appreciate that people are put in the effort to try to vote. It should not be so hard. And I hope that it is always recognized that what is important to me is that we are participating in the process.
You can tell right there that Representative Devendorf is someone who's not only thrilled to represent her district, but is someone who's thrilled to strengthen voting rights and to help strengthen the American experiment. The representative fights for those who can't fight for themselves. And here's something that didn't really get many headlines in this election season, but it illustrates the good work that the Democratic majority in the state of Michigan has done here in the last 2 years. Representative Devendorf, who, let me remind you, is a strong progressive fighter in Lansing, and who's also Michigan's first openly non-binary lawmaker and one of the first openly bisexual legislators, got to celebrate after her Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act passed both the House and Senate in bipartisan fashion. Now, this bill provides additional protections to heirs who inherit their property as tenant in common. And it's a bill that provides protections to small family farms and farms owned by people of color, as Representative Devendorf explained here last year when she introduced the bill.
It's one of the main ways that Black and brown farmers have lost farms throughout the history of this country, because in absence of a will, you aren't able to hand down your property. It is easily split up. So this piece of legislation has been easily passed in the South because it was prioritized with no opposition. It's something that estate lawyers are really interested in seeing happen because it's a giant headache, but also it really helps small family farmers and really low-income property owners, period, hold on to the equity that they have in absence of a will. Because so often the most vulnerable folks just do not have that legal assistance in place.
So Representative Devendorf found solutions to help people hold on to their homes and hold on to their farms. When you want a definition of what progressivism is all about, well, right there you have it. And that's why I'm hoping Representative Devendorf wins her next race next week in the 77th District, so the good people of North Lansing, DeWitt, Eagle, and Westphalia townships re-elect a person who got into the game for one reason: to help people. Oh, the Michigan Farm Bureau has endorsed Devendorf's opponent, MAGA Republican Katie Ness-Smith, because Devendorf voted in favor of the Democrats' Clean Energy and Jobs Act last year, which included giving farmers a better chance to take part in large renewable energy projects to not only help the state get to its carbon-free goal by the year 2040, but to help family farmers keep their lands. It's Democrats who believe in property rights. I don't know what the Michigan Farm Bureau is doing, since I thought they're in the game to protect family farmers. But you see, the Farm Bureau opposed that bill and would rather allow the fossil fuel industry to run rampant across the state. Now, the Michigan Democratic majority in Lansing hasn't been absolutely perfect, which again, we progressives can admit because we're not part of a cult. We can do this thing called thinking once in a while. But they've done some pretty substantial things since gaining control of the legislature, like passing sensible gun safety bills, including red flag laws, to give the courts the authority to remove guns out of the hands of those deemed a danger to others or themselves. Democrats repealed right to work for less, which restored power to unions and hard-working families. Democrats also provided additional funding for public schools and provided free meals for all school children, which is the exact same policy championed by Democratic vice presidential nominee Tim Walz since he signed a similar bill as Minnesota's governor. Now, sticking with public education, another strong progressive, State Representative Betsy Kafia, narrowly won her contested race in the 103rd House District, which comprises of Leelanau County, Grand Traverse County, and Benzie County. Now, last year, she talked to me right here on the podcast about getting an amendment passed that maybe didn't garner all of the headlines, but changed the lives of many students in her district. The amendment was all about getting equal school transportation funding for her district. And listen to Representative Kafia talk about the issue and how it's changing things for the better in the schools in her district.
One thing that I'm particularly proud of is a project of mine. So if you don't mind indulging, I'll talk to you just for a second about how this works. So rural school districts, there has been an inequity that is longstanding when it comes to state funding for large geographic rural school districts. And it impacts all across Michigan, but certainly northern Michigan where I live. Basically, rural school districts, while getting no extra money to cover this from the state, have been driving hundreds of miles bus routes. And so spending as much as 10 to 14% of their budget in some cases on gas and bus costs. So this is before the child even steps into the classroom. I was at an event last night with a principal who was talking about how here for TCAPS, which is one of the largest school districts, he was having to sort of do bake sales to help pay for AP Gov classes so that his students would be as prepared when they went for college, application and exams as some of the students from downstate school districts that had really excellent advanced placement classes. And he was telling me last night, it had a lot to do with just not having equity in this transportation funding, because all of that money that should have been going into the classroom was having to go into the gas tank. Some of my school districts, Benzie Central, they drive the equivalent of northern Michigan to San Francisco in a single day for their bus route. It's a couple hundred square miles. And Kalkaska County, where I grew up, this was such a severe issue. They ran out of money and closed early when I was in high school and reopened with no busing in a 400 square mile school district. So just unbelievable hardship for families trying to drive their kids to school every day. So that was a long explainer to say I tackled this one when I got here because it's been talked about by politicians my whole life. And I'm really proud to say my first standalone policy bill had a tiered per pupil per mile equity formula proposal. And the school aid fund chairs, Regina Weiss and Darren Camilleri, who are both former public educators themselves, they heard me out, they worked with me, and we actually got that into the school aid fund budget, a new equity formula to provide for rural transportation. So all of that money that was going into the gas tank, we now can divert back to the classroom, more field trips, more art, more music, more mental health FTEs, and really investing in kids in rural Michigan and making sure that all of our kids are getting the best possible education. So I'm really proud of that one because in my first 6 months, I got to take a big whack at a problem that's been around for pretty much my entire life.
You see, that's working for the people. That's working to help people. Her opponent, MAGA Republican Lisa Trombley, isn't trying to get into government to help people. Trombley said in her debate against Betsy Kafia that on the issue of climate change, and I'm quoting here, I'm probably not going to do much on this topic. Probably not going to do much on this topic as Michigan winters are disappearing. Not going to do much. Oh, that's awesome. Really, that's just awesome. And on the issue of gun violence, the MAGA Republican Trombley says, we've got too many laws. Guys, that's pure insanity. Betsy Kafia offers sanity, and she's doing the hard work to help the people who don't have a voice to help themselves in their district. Let's move back downstate where we've got Matt Maddock, the MAGA Republican nutjob who is currently the representative of Michigan's 51st district, which is entirely in Oakland County, running from west to east, from Milford to Commerce Township, and then north to Highland Township on the west side, and White Lake Township to the northeast side. You may know of that name, Matt Maddock, because his wife, the former MAGA Republican co-chair Michonne Maddock, has been charged with being one of those fake Trump electors who tried to steal the election of 2020. You see, Matt and his wife are the worst of the worst. Matt Maddock hasn't lifted one finger to help the people in his district. He's just there to enrich himself. All he does is serve his dear leader Trump. That's it. That's all he does in the state legislature. But there's an alternative. There's a strong progressive Democrat named Sarah May Seward who's offering solutions to help make things better for the people in her district. For example, when Sarah was on here last summer, she explained why one issue that she'll press for is to put polluter pay over the finish line so that corporations just can't pollute an area and then pack up and leave it up to the town, city, or county taxpayers to clean up the mess.
So for polluter pay, it hits pretty close to home. Our major river here in my district, the Huron River, it has been polluted by the same company 3 times. And this is the river that I grew up canoeing on. Our 6th grade trip in middle school was walking down to the river and hopping in a canoe. You can no longer trust that water because Tri-Bar has dumped PFAS in it twice. And they dumped hexavalent chromium in it. And that's the Aaron Brockovich chemical. And yet they don't have to pay for the cleanup. They don't have to pay for the testing and the monitoring of it. And our area is filled with fishers, hunters, and you can't eat the fish from the river now. And I'm still worried about the fact that a lot of our wildlife drink from the river or from parts that come off of the river. How can we trust that the deer that we hunt are edible? So it's extremely frustrating that the taxpayers have had to pay for the cleanup and the monitoring of the rivers. And I believe that polluters should pay. I mean, Tri-Bar is still worth millions of dollars. They haven't taken a hit at all.
Sarah May Seward is completely all about her district, considering the bevy of commissions and boards that she volunteers to be on. She just wants to help people economically, environmentally, and socially. She just wants to make her corner of the state better. Same with the young Austin Marsman, a Democrat who's challenging the disastrous and disturbing MAGA Republican State House Minority Leader Matt Hall. Hall not only promotes an extreme right-wing agenda in the State House, but he believes that his main reason for being in politics, like Matt Maddock, is to simply serve his dear leader Trump. Well, as Austin told me last summer, that's not why he got into the race to win the 42nd House District in Allegan and Kalamazoo counties.
He's had a pattern of unacceptable behavior and absent leadership, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. But our campaign's been rooted in the community. Like I said, I'm from West Michigan. I know the challenges we face. I know that the games that Matt's playing are only leaving us farther and farther behind. He's been notably absent, and the unacceptable behavior, the disconnect from the district is truly evident, whether it's the incident with his girlfriend that came to light a while back, or the gambling, or the other things that are out there. People want someone who shows up for them. And that's kind of why I got into the race. I had no idea just how bad it was, the unacceptable behavior, skipping work to warm up the crowd at a Trump rally when they're voting on paramedic licensing and public safety. I was floored.
There's 4 strong progressives who are in this whole thing to make things better. And don't forget, up in the UP in northern Michigan, as Democrats Christiana Reynolds and Jody Decker put their names on the ballots to present another choice, a choice for freedom, democracy, and sanity. The Michigan MAGAs, they're not trying to make things better. They're not trying to help people. They care about destruction and hurting the people that they've been taught to hate. And they'll go to any lengths possible to do it. Here's a story that a good friend from the UP sent me today, and it's from TV6 News, and I'm quoting here. 2 township clerks in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan were removed from their election duties this week after they planned to hand count votes in Tuesday's election, state officials said. Director of Michigan Bureau of Elections, Jonathan Brader, said in a letter dated Monday that the Rock River Township clerk and the deputy clerk intended to conduct a hand count prior to the county process of canvassing the results. Since former President Donald Trump and his allies have spread lies claiming that widespread fraud cost Trump the 2020 election, some Republicans have sought to replace modern voting machines with the more laborious, error-prone process of hand counting, despite no evidence of widespread fraud or major irregularities. Michigan law requires jurisdictions to use voting machines to tabulate ballots. Research shows that machine counting is faster and more accurate than hand counting. So apparently these 2 clerks believe that an originalist interpretation of the Constitution negates county, state, and federal authority over elections, that they are the ones who have full authority over elections. That's not how it works. You see, these people will go to any length to win because in the MAGA, White Christian Nationalist fascist world, they are the true leaders and the true patriots of this country. See, they have nothing to offer on policy. They have no solution, no policies to speak of that people can celebrate and they can say, yes, that is helping me. They aren't going to champion abortion rights, a higher minimum wage, paid sick leave, union rights, corporate price gouging, stopping corporations from polluting our environment. No, they champion only one thing. Actually, they champion just one person, Trump. How pathetic. But it is scary to think of what MAGA will do to the state house if Republicans gain control of the gavel. Down ballot races are just as important as the presidential race. Please make sure that Democrats keep control and increase their majority in the state house.
He enjoys watching sporting events from years ago. He can recite most of the 1984 Detroit Tigers lineup. He will go to the mat in saying Michigan has produced some of the greatest music in the past 60 years. But most of all, he enjoys the loyalty of a fine dog while sipping on a tasty Michigan beer. Oh, and he loves talking about politics, if you haven't been able to tell yet. It's the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. Need more Pat? Visit and subscribe to leftoflansing.com. Now, back to Pat.
If you want to see how the Trump MAGA movement is a fascist movement bankrolled by billionaires who not only want major tax breaks, but who want to get complete control of the levers of governmental power, read up on Elon Musk's so-called political action committee's treatment of quote-unquote volunteers. Jake LaHood from Wired has a new article describing how Elon's America PAC workers say that they were flown to Michigan, driven around in the back of a U-Haul, and threatened to pay for their own hotel bills unless they met their door-knocking quotas. And one worker alleged they didn't even know that they signed up to help Donald Trump. Now, does this surprise you at all? I mean, it shouldn't. It really shouldn't when it comes to how Elon Musk and dear leader have always shown very little value in working people. These two have done everything in their power to destroy the working class and to destroy unions. Oh, and one door knocker said in the story that they were told they would have to pay for their own flight home. Man, I will link to that story wherever you're listening to this podcast because it's a remarkable write-up by Wired. And it just goes to show that we have other places to go find excellent reporting and some really fine media alternatives, and we don't have to rely on legacy media. Hell, that's one reason why I started this podcast. And in fact, it leads me to my Left of Lansing last call for this week. So many of you are aware of the news that the LA Times and Washington Post announced that they would not endorse a candidate in this presidential election. Now, it's especially astounding considering the Washington Post has the words, "Democracy dies in darkness," splashed on its front pages each and every day. But because billionaire owner Jeff Bezos fears dear leader and wants to be on his good side for whatever reasons, he is muzzling his own editorial staff in the most important election of our lifetimes. But what did we expect would happen when billionaires buy up and gobble up TV and newspapers? As Ely Mistal said on Twitter, billionaires treat these media sources as their toys and as a way to spread the messages that they want to spread. Here in mid-Michigan, the Sinclair-owned NBC station scrapped all of its local news programming on the weekends, so that way it can spread Sinclair's right-wing programming throughout each and every weekend. That's the goal. That's why the billionaires buy these stations and buy the newspapers, to spread their messages, not to inform the people. Informing the people? Look, we're getting more and more news deserts across the country, just as we're seeing in mid-Michigan. So it's no wonder that after the Washington Post failed to endorse Kamala Harris, it's no wonder that over 250,000 people canceled their subscription to the Washington Post. And while that's sad for many of the good reporters and journalists there, how else are the people supposed to voice their disdain to how the billionaire class, a class that wants a little fascism for additional wealth and power, how else are the people supposed to fight back? I ask you, please tell me, what's a better alternative? To me, I think you take away the billionaire toys or refuse to play with their toys anymore. Legacy media has failed us time and time again during this election cycle, drawing false equivalency over false equivalency between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. While he's celebrated by legacy media and he's celebrated by his little fascist lackeys who keep getting more and more airtime, that same legacy media holds Kamala Harris to a completely different and completely higher standards. Like former First Lady Michelle Obama said while campaigning with Kamala in Kalamazoo last week, while Trump gets to say the most deranged and disgusting and dangerous things, and people just say, well, that's just Trump being Trump, isn't he great? Harris is expected to dazzle at every moment. And meanwhile, she's also supposed to give highly detailed policy plans, but when she does, the media just yawns. They don't care. Her campaign is actually trying to save democracy and help people, but legacy media would rather spend its time talking about the horse race rather than focusing on how MAGA policies have and will continue to destroy the country. But legacy media would rather talk about who's up, who's down, and talk about poll after poll after poll rather than cover the policies that they say, that they claim that they're all about covering. Legacy media is failing the people, and so the people are leaving legacy media and finding alternative media that's actually doing some good work. And I have featured many of those people right here on this podcast. The corporate media structure has failed America. And if we lose democracy, I wonder if corporate media will understand how it played a role in it. We know better.
You're listening to the Left of Lansing podcast. The music you're hearing is by Wanderbeats. To hear the latest project, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site. Now back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
That's going to do it for this edition of The Left of Lansing. Let me know what you think about everything I talked about here today as we head into Election Day by emailing me, leftoflansing@gmail.com. That's leftoflansing@gmail.com. I'll be making many comments on Twitter and Facebook as results are rolling in on election night, and then I will voice my reaction on next week's show. So follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And again, I'll soon be posting some YouTube live videos so that way I can interact with many of you. So stay tuned for that announcement. Visit MichiganVoting.org for any additional information when it comes to casting your vote in this election. Early voting numbers are exploding across the state. So please, if you've got time this weekend, go out and vote. And then you don't have to worry about it on Election Day. Plus, it'll help local clerks in getting the ballots ready to be counted on election night. So hey, get out there and vote early if you can. What kind of country and state of Michigan will we have next week at this time? We'll talk about that next week. Remember, take the battle to them. Thank you, Michigan.
The Left of Lansing podcast was produced by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and hosted by, yes, Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. And thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. Remember to visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to the Left of Lansing podcast.